Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys about a number of news articles. The one that I'm reading right now is off CNN that are discussing some new studies about the concept of fat but fit. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And actually I want to thank Coach Russell Taylor for this. Yeah, I've seen several people share this already today, but he's the first one that I saw sharing it anywhere on social media. And that's where I first saw it and went and looked and saw that at least 6 different news agencies are reporting this. Now, the reason this is important is because when we start talking about fitness, we start talking about health, all of these things, we have these concepts out there like, look, if you exercise and you're active and you eat good, it can offset some of the negative health effects of obesity. And, you know, a lot of people in the whole fat acceptance movement will say health at any size. You can be fat but fit. Now, here's the reality of it. We do have studies out there showing that people who lift weights and do cardio, who carry the same amount of body fat, do have less problems than people who are sedentary. They absolutely do. They are not as unhealthy. That is an absolute fact. However, we have studies like this that are looking at it that are also showing fat but fit people, or people who are overweight but still metabolically healthy, meaning, in other words, their lipid profiles look okay, their fasting glucose and everything looks okay, that they're still not as healthy as people who are at a healthy body fat. They're not as healthy. One of these studies found is that fat but fit people still have cardiovascular disease at 28% higher than normal people do. In other words, someone who is otherwise in good health, and we look at their health at the moment, their blood work looks good. They're carrying 20 or 30 pounds of extra fat. Someone who's carrying, 30 pounds of extra fat, more than the healthy range for what they should have on their body. The studies are showing they still have cardiovascular disease at 28% higher than the general population of people who aren't obese. And that's not good news for the fat but fit movement. And this is what we've got to look at, guys. I mean, this whole thing about just accepting yourself, as long as you're active, you'll be okay if you're overweight, seems to only be partially true. It will offset it. It will offset some of the health risk. It will not eliminate all of the health risk. And I mean, the data is there, the research is there, we're seeing it. It's just simply not true that it will completely eliminate it. Being overweight is, in and of itself, its own health risk, even if you are doing everything else right. Now, the added point being, that people who eat really healthy, people who eat a relatively clean diet, diets higher in fiber, diets lower in saturated fat, things like that, people who eat more vegetables, we could also argue they're going to be less obese than if they didn't do that, right? I mean, we can look at that from a different perspective and say, they're still going to have health risks from being overweight, but at least the people who are eating a better diet, who are lifting, who are doing cardio, probably aren't as fat as they would be if they didn't do those things. That person who's carrying 30 pounds of extra body fat, if they didn't do those things, might be carrying 70 or 80 pounds of extra fat, maybe 100 pounds of extra fat. So the point is, we don't want to tell people not to do these things. We still want to encourage people to eat well. We want to encourage people to lift weights, encourage people to do cardio, even if they're obese. But people do need to understand that carrying too much body fat, even if you're really physically active, even if you eat a good diet, still increases your risk of heart disease. The risk is still there. And the thing is, a lot of times people are going to chime in and say, well, what about people who are high on the BMI scale because of muscle? Well, a lot of us will fall under there. I mean, even me, if I keep cutting, I'm still going to be overweight on that scale. Even if I cut down lean enough to have deep six-pack, I'm still going to be overweight on that scale. So the question becomes, what about those of us in that area? The answer, we don't actually know. We don't have enough scientific data to answer that. Now, some doctors think that we're going to be obviously at a much lower risk than someone who's carrying extra fat, meaning carrying an extra 25 pounds of muscle mass isn't going to be as bad for you as carrying an extra 25 pounds of body fat. But here's the caveat. Is it risk-free? We don't know. And the truth be told, it probably isn't completely risk-free, meaning it might lower things like cancer risk. Sure, having more muscle mass, we know the more muscle you have, the lower the rate of cancer. That's a given. But what about strain on our hearts and everything? What about potential risk of heart disease? What about other problems? We simply don't know. What about strain on different organs in your body? We don't know. It's possible that being overweight from muscle is going to contribute to those. And the other reason that this doesn't get factored in, though, and the reason some experts say there's no reason to study it, and this is going to really piss off the natural community, because simply put, without drugs involved, it's pretty unlikely that a human being will ever be obese just from muscle mass. Now people will say, what? In other words, when you look at the BMI charts, almost nobody on earth has the genetic potential to gain enough muscle mass to be morbidly obese without the use of drugs of some type. So that's why it doesn't get factored into the health equation, because, well, we could argue normal people don't need to worry about this. In other words, some guy who's like, well, I'm going to be a full natty and get as big as I possibly can drug-free, odds are he's probably not going to go over 200 pounds. In other words, take guys like Frank Zane, 190 ripped at 5'11", but he used anabolics to get there. In other words, most people who are just lifting weights are still probably not going to reach an obese level unless they bulk up and carry extra body fat on top of it. It's probably not going to be done just with muscle. I'm not saying there aren't genetic outliers. There's probably a handful of people out there, less than 1% of the population, probably genetically can get big enough while staying fairly lean to be at risk of this. But for the vast majority of people, it's simply not going to be an issue, and that's why they're not going to really study it. There's not enough interest in studying it, because in surveys that they've done, when they've taken people who lift weights very, very rigorously and looked at their BMIs, the only ones that they found who were obese purely due to muscle mass also admitted in the anonymous surveys where, they didn't keep their personal information with it, they had also used steroids. In other words, no one who had sworn in the studies that they were lifetime drug-free actually was at risk of that happening. They haven't really found cases. I think out of one study that looked at like 1,000 lifters, they only found 1 or 2 guys who were technically obese, who had a healthy body fat, who were non-steroid users. It was a very, very, very small number. So that's where we start to get into the debate when we start saying, well, they're looking at just BMI. Why are they looking at that instead of body fat percentage? Because body fat percentage is much harder to measure. And because for the overwhelming majority of the population, over 99% of people, even those who exercise, you're probably not going to be obese just from muscle gains unless drugs come into the mix, and anabolics in and of themselves carry their own health risk. And that would be a confounding factor that would make multivariate analysis really difficult to look at. Trying to take drug users and look at anabolic users, their body composition and everything else, when we're trying to study the general population and try to factor that in, there's just no way we can do that. That's really a far more complicated, more expensive study than we're trying to look at when we're looking at studies on obesity. Is it something that hopefully gets studied later down the road? Sure, but it's not a high priority for anyone when we're facing an obesity epidemic right now. But the take-home message from this, what we know from these studies, is that the whole concept of fat but fit is partially a myth, meaning you can be fit while you're fat, but not as fit as if you weren't fat. And that's kind of the take-home message. You would still be healthier otherwise. And the other problem with it is, what we run into is that oftentimes these are short-lived experiences, meaning people who carry 30 pounds of extra body fat, 40 pounds of extra body fat, for a few years their blood work might look good. In other words, if they're eat a decent diet, they're fairly physically active, such as some of these YouTubers like this Loie Lane chick, she's saying, well, I'm healthy, my blood work looks good. Check it again in 5 years. And that's the other problem they're running into now. When we're looking at these metabolically fit people who are obese, they probably haven't been obese for a very long period of time yet. It's usually less than a decade. If you stay that level of obese for 10 years or 15 years, the number of people who are capable of maintaining pretty blood work starts to drop dramatically. Almost everyone who carries excess body fat to the point of morbid obesity, eventually their blood work starts to look bad no matter what they do. It's just a matter of time. And that's the other problem we run into with this, is that they might be healthier for a little while, but it's not going to be sustainable in the long term. They will eventually have to lose the body fat, or they will suffer the health consequences. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.